I'm going to call the Lobster Board meeting to order, and to ensure that Eric Reed is paying attention, aloha. The first item is to ensure that we have approval of the agenda. Are there any other items that any board member would like to bring up? Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I have a tasking motion I want to add later on if I can on the new business or other business.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Does anybody else? Dan McKernan.
Yes, under other business, I just want to bring an issue forward to the board regarding the take of lobsters by non-trap gears. Very brief.
Thank you, Dan. Anybody else? We are going to receive a lot of public comment this morning on items not on the agenda. So I am going to make a statement at the end regarding addendum 27 and some complexities with that. I'm not looking for action, but I just want to make sure it's clear to the board some of my thoughts around that particular issue. Moving ahead on the agenda, we have the approval of two proceedings from both January and March of 2024. Did any member of the board see any issues with the minutes from those meetings? Seeing none, we will accept those by consensus. Number 3 on the agenda is public comment. As I said, I am aware that there are members of the public that want to speak on addendums that focus on both trackers, gauge increases, and the Mitchell Amendment. I would remind those who want to speak to the latter, addendum 30, that the commission is still accepting public comment on that addendum until June 3rd. And a second webinar will be held on April 9th. So I will not be taking comments only on addendum 30. However, I do recognize that addendum 27 and 30 are somewhat linked. So I will give some latitude, but please do not focus strictly on addendum 30 and make sure your comments are sent into the commission through the public comment process. Knowing we're going to have members of the lobster industry who are going to want to address the lobster board, we have added 30 minutes to the agenda here this morning. It's already a very full agenda, so I will take comments from people in attendance and then online. Tony, could we, well, I guess I can do that since they can hear me. With those folks who are online who would like to speak on the agenda, on items not on the agenda, could you please raise your virtual hand on the webinar? And how many people are in the room plan to speak? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just 2 online. Okay. So, so because we have limited time, I'd ask you to please all avoid repeating the same points. To avoid that, please just reference a speaker on a topic and say that you agree with somebody else who has spoken before you. I would also ask that you consolidate your comments by having one person, if possible, speaking on behalf of groups or organizations. Because we have so many people, I'm only going to give each speaker 3 minutes to address the board, and it's going to be a firm stop at 3 minutes. Please know that board members have all received over 100 pages of comments in our supplemental material. We are aware of the concerns that the industry is now bringing up. Today, we are here to listen as a board and not to respond to the comments. Please, members of the industry, I would ask you please not to take the lack of response as discounting your comments. More will be said on that at the end of the meeting. At this time, I am going to ask for, do you have the list, Caitlin, of people in the room? No, I'm going to take those in the room first, who took the time to travel down, and I'll have those comment first, and then we'll go to those online. So the first online is Christian Porter from the Maine Lobstermen's Association, who wants to speak on both addendum 27 and 29. So I'm going to ask you to consolidate your comments, Christian. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the American Lobster Management Board, to hear my comments today. First of all, I want to start off with Addendum 29. I think the MLA would request that the board relook at the 24/7 provision. This was mentioned in the comments and by one of the members here, Steve Train, that this would be a little overreach for our fishery. And people need to know that in Maine, the lobster boat isn't just a fishing boat. It might be a school bus, it might be a grocery wagon, it might be a picnic cruiser. So some of that data is not useful in spatial management. It probably will be noise and it will probably be a burden. So we just ask if there's a way to look at if those trackers can be either turned off or set in a skiff when you are on when you're using your boat for personal use. The second thing is, and I know that other people here to talk about Addendum 27, and I know we're not supposed to talk about Addendum 30, but I think 30 is going to be a mess if you don't address Addendum 27. I think that, in our comments, we said that there's going to be some issues with Canada and there's going to be some socioeconomic issues, and we don't know if those have been addressed. I think we need to relook at them. I think we need time to get this figured out with the trade, and I think one of those ways may be to look at, kind of skip forward and goes directly to the vent increase and not the gauge. That way it doesn't affect trade. The lobsters that are landed are still the same size. And maybe that could be maybe a stopgap till we can figure out the trade issue and let the science play out for a little bit longer and see if we really are in a downturn. And I just want to give a personal view, if I've got a little bit of time left. I fish in an area down East Maine called the Gray Zone, and we share an area with Canada. We're not on a line. We commingle in that area, and with the gauge increase, I will be throwing lobsters overboard. Not to say I'll catch you next year when you're bigger. It will be going directly to another boat and probably be shipped in a lobster truck right in front of my house. So that's pretty tough pill to swallow when you're on an unequal playing field with your neighbor, and that just doesn't, that's tough. So thank you for hearing me out. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Next up is Dustin Delano, and then Frank Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name is Dustin Delano, and I'm a fourth-generation lobster fisherman from Friendship, Maine. I'm here to represent myself as a harvester of over 20 years and to also represent the New England Fishermen's Stewardship Association. Thank you for providing extra time for folks to make their comments today. And since you have all received NEFSA's comments in your supplementals, I'll be brief and allow others a chance to speak. I'm going to allow the inner harvester in me to speak out and be very blunt on this issue. Many of you may think this ask for a 1-year delay in implementation of Addendum 27's gauge increase is just another charade because fishermen just plain and simply do not want to increase their gauges. I'm here to tell you today that part of what I just said is completely true. A majority of fishermen I know do not want an increase in the minimum size of their gauge. However, despite the unusual ask and the current circumstances, we desperately need time to address the issues surrounding Canada. Our fishermen commingle with Canadians, just as Kristen spoke about in the Gray Zone, and beyond that. Beyond that, dealers and the lobster chain move in lockstep with Canadian counterparts. Lobster dealers have overcome many hurdles in the last few years, from things such as retaliatory tariffs on lobster to the COVID-19 pandemic. Dealers and fishery managers did a great job to keep everyone fishing in those instances. What we're asking here is to allow for a 1-year delay to help us avoid another catastrophic problem where dealers, harvesters, and even fishery managers are forced to improvise on a whim, taking risks and playing more games of trial and error in the final hour. The North Atlantic lobster fishery must work in lockstep with Canada to ensure the stability of markets and trade. We ask you today to please consider this ask from the many New England stakeholders providing comment. And I also just want to add to NEPS's support for the MLA's ask on the 24/7 tracking requirements from Addendum 27. We also share that concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Dustin. Frank? And Hugh Reynolds will be up next.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't want to waste your time. I agree with Dustin and Christian about all this. So everything in my letter is the same as what they've got. So I'm in agreement with them, and I'm here for the MLU. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your brevity. And we have both your written comments here that you've passed along, as well as the comments in the supplemental. We'll take Hugh, and then Hank Soul, and then Kurt Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. My name is Hugh Reynolds. I own Greenhead Lobster. It's a wholesale distribution and lobster processing company in Stonington, Maine. We have over 100 employees, and we deal with over 100 independent harvesters on a daily basis. I'm sorry to come to the game so late, but the impacts of 27 are starting to ripple through our communities, and the chat is getting pretty severe. We are, of the 100 independent harvesters, I'd like to speak to them briefly. They're not ready for this. The Colby College study in Addendum 27 has the economic impact at $84 million. That's combined with a 10% reduction in the catch. That's the DMR science saying 10% down, and the overall economic impact of $840 million. In our town alone, it's $8 million. In the times of raging inflation and what the fishermen are battling, I just don't think they're ready. This is one of the things we're just asking for time to brace for impact for this measure. Then I'd like to speak about our own company. We barely survived the retaliatory tariffs of 1819, had to buckle down. And we said we wouldn't have we probably wouldn't survive another change in if there was a change in the supply matrix. Now we look at a very serious change in our supply matrix that would be disruptive to the lobster community that binds us in the New England states and our Canadian neighbors. I don't think the American deal, I don't think it's good for the industry. We're not ready for it. I have talked to my Canadian partners. They realize that we're all tied together, and they are interested in increasing their measure and cooperating, and with a great respect for the science that has been done with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. There is a possibility that they will cooperate and make this not such a harsh impact to companies like myself. So that is what I'm here today. Thank you for your time. And that is all we have. We have this great ask, just to have a pause. Let us consider, look at science, and brace for impact. We're not ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. I've got Hank Soul, Kurt Brown, and then Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'm Hank Soul here representing the Atlantic Offshore Lobstermen's Association. Submitted a letter to many of the commissioners a couple of days ago regarding our concerns, not so much about either Addendum 27 or Addendum 30. The AOLA doesn't really take a position on those, but what we came to realize is that there was an interplay between those two, and when you consider the potential impacts in tandem, could have very serious implications on not just, we believe, the lobstermen, but also the shoreside processors. We're in the dark because we don't understand what those impacts might be, because at least today we're not able to see that any analysis have been done of those. And that was the ask that we had at the commission, is that before moving ahead with both of these, that the commission try to gather some information, particularly from the processing community, on what they see that the impacts would be, and bring that back for the commissioners to consider, so they can make a more informed vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hank. Kurt Brown. Kurt is famous for the phrase, people don't come to Maine to eat chicken.
Infamous. And you'll notice, Commissioner, that I have two button-down shirts, one I wore last night and the same one we wore at our meeting 2 weeks ago. So this is my fancy dress here. Thank you very much for having me this morning, everybody. I very much appreciate it. My name is Kurt Brown. I am a lobsterman out of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, and a marine biologist at Ready Seafood based in Portland and Saco. We collaborate with the Department of Marine Resources in Maine on a number of research projects. Actually, right now we have Emma from the department coming into our facility looking for lobsters that are ready to molt so that we can track growth and learn more about that. We also collaborate on a number of other projects. We do that because we care about the future of this industry. And I think all of us in this room are here for that same reason. In the past, we have seen ups and downs in both landings and surveys for lobster in Maine. This current conversation is driven mostly by downturn in Down East Maine off of all-time highs in the number of juvenile lobsters that we've been seeing. We saw a similar decline in the same area from 2013 to 2015, and that was followed by those same all-time highs. This past year, we saw a bump in settlement for the first time in a while. Which was very good to see in both the suction sampling survey that DMR does that Steve and I have been a part of for, I'll say, decades at this point in time. It's been a while. And also in a collaborative research project that Ready Seafood works on with the University of Maine looking at settlement in deeper water. And we saw an uptick in settlement in deeper water as well. I guess my ask today is, given these small positive signs, a year isn't a trend by any means, and I'm certainly not here to question the department's science. But given these positive trends and also the economic implications that we've heard about so far this morning in Maine and also with our Canadian counterparts, maybe it would be a good time to hit the pause button on a gauge increase and see if we can get some coordination across states and across countries, especially with Canada, on this issue, because the implications are drastic and severe, as you've heard. If something does absolutely need to happen, I would echo what Kristen said earlier, and maybe the technical committee could look at the implications of a event increase alone. But I'll leave it at that. I appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kurt. And the last comment in the room is Drew.
Thank you, Drew Minkavage. I'm an attorney for the North Atlantic Lobster Alliance, which is the dealers and processors from the New England states. Don't want to reiterate a lot of what was said. Obviously, a lot of concern throughout the lobster industry about this pending gauge increase. What I would like to ask, though, is for the commission to really consider and try and pursue, if it is determined that conservation measures, increased conservation measures are necessary by looking at additional science and more thorough analysis, then is there a conservation measure that can be taken that decouples from the gauge increase and takes the trade issues off the table? Because that is the key here. There are many ways to get increased conservation in this fishery without creating intense ramifications within international trade. So if we can go down that road, be it the vent increase or some other measure we haven't discussed or thought of at this moment, I think this commission and the industry owes it to itself to try and pursue that avenue so that we can maintain the goals and aspirations of the management plan and keep international trade and the robust dealers and processing industry in place to create a strong market for the entire industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Who do we have on the line?
Andrea Tomlinson.
First up is Andrea Tomlinson. Andrea, can you hear us? Or
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
loud and clear.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. Andrea Tomlinson from the New England Young Fishermen's Alliance. We are a workforce development nonprofit that has come into the scene in the last 2 years. Our big programming currently is we train young deckhands and sternmen with at least 3 years experience on the back of a boat from Portland down to Gloucester on what it entails to become an owner operator. It's called deckhand to captain training. So I'd like to speak to the socioeconomic effects of Addendum 27. I'd like to see we definitely confer with Tristan, Dustin, Hank Sewell, Hugh Reynolds, on their comment, but there's a couple of things that New England Young Fishermen's Alliance would like to see, and that is a more comprehensive data set with more industry collaborative research involvement. We do require our young trainees to do at least 15 hours of collaborative research and or advocacy. Advocacy would be giving comment on this meeting today, showing up at a council meeting. So we'd love to see some more collaborative research on this recruitment issue that incorporates the industry a little bit more. The other thing I'd like to speak to is I was just at a conference called iFish put on by NIOSH. So that's the Northeast Center for Occupational Health and Safety. That falls under NIOSH, which falls under the CDC. So we were in Rome with a bunch of social scientists who were studying the effects of regulations on fishermen's mental health. So this is happening all over the world, unbeknownst to me, until I was at the iFish conference in Rome this January. So this is not an easy time to be in the arena of trying to encourage young people to get into this industry. We hear a lot of young people saying they don't want to get into the industry due to several factors: access, cost. They feel that the industry is highly overregulated in both brown fish and lobster. That's something we hear from young people. And they also feel as though they don't have a voice. I met an 18-year-old at Maine Fishermen's Forum who says he doesn't go to meetings because he doesn't feel that he has a voice. So I feel that we have to do something about that. And along that same note, the materials that I see the ASMFC putting out concerning this are really fabulous. I'm looking at the white paper as we speak that was put out in May on this addendum, and they're really tangible. We love sending them out to young fishermen and women to have them look over to understand this. I know you can't comment today, Lobster Board, but I was going to encourage the ASMFC, if it's possible, to even work through your board members and or your representatives in the states to do some outreach and education on these upcoming regulations so the young fishing community can understand more thoroughly, you know, who, what, when, where, and why. I would just encourage you to do that. I'd be happy to help and assist in doing that as well. I think there's a real gap between
Andrea, I'm going to
okay.
cut
All
you
right.
off for 3 minutes. I appreciate your comments. So
Thank you.
next up is Charlene Cates, and I just would remind the speakers to not cover ground that has already been covered. Charlene, are you on still?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We have loud and clear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Kristen Porter, Dustin, Hugh, Kurt, Andrea, and the others who have spoken today. My name is Charlene Cates. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer at Machias Savings Bank. We're bringing an economic lens. I represent a 155-year-old, $2.5 billion bank with 15 locations across the state. Our coastal communities in particular are in Calais, Machias, Columbia, Bar Harbor, Ellsworth, Rockland, and Portland, so we see the entire coast. We hold over 700 loans to individuals who are engaged in commercial fisheries, representing $42 million in exposure. These totals do not include loans to processors, retailers, bait distributors, or trap shops. This does not include consumer loans, mortgages, and related household exposure with our fishing community. We cite these numbers not to protect ourselves, but to give you an idea of the ripple effect of decreased profitability on communities. We can say we are already seeing signs of financial stress across the industry, whether it's a loan modification request or a conversation in a loan officer's office with fishermen. Addendum 27 adds to these existing vulnerabilities. From our economic lens, and we will stay in our lane, this is too much, too fast. The science may say a 10% reduction, but cash flow can cut deeper. Imagine if someone proposed a potential 20% or more pay cut for you in January, with inflation climbing, your interest rate not yet dropping, and your bottom line shrinking. The industry is caught in a perilous time of rapid transformation. And we know, as Andrea said, uncertainty and fear do slow economies by shrinking spending across all sectors. We encourage more conservative and iterative change in conjunction with Canada in order to help our families thrive, the industry remain viable, and the state prepare for what are anticipated and more changes ahead. We thank you for your time this morning, and we do support the lobster industry in these efforts.
Great. Thank you for those comments, Charlene. Next up is Wayne Delano. Wayne?
Hey there, can you hear me?
Got you, Wayne.
Hey, good morning. I want to first say I agree with pretty much everything everyone else has said, but well, anyway, I'm Wayne Delano. I'm a third generation lobster fisherman from Friendship, Maine. I've been lobstering for close to 40 years, made my living in marine resources since I was a child. I'm here today to express support for comments submitted by New England Fishermen Stewards Association. I want to raise one issue that wasn't included in the comment. Commissioner Kelleher went around to the zone council on form for addendum. I expressed my opposition at the Zone D council meeting. At that time, I suggested to Pat at the council that if addendum.
Wayne, make sure you stay close to your microphone because you're going in and out.
Yeah, okay. If the addendum 27 was going to go forward with the increase, it needed to be made in smaller increments than a 1/16 of an inch. The last gauge increase we had happened in 1989. When that increased by 1/32, it was a manageable approach. Fast forward to 2024, I mean, I feel strongly that hit our bottom lines due to a 10% or better reduction, and I think it's more than 10% in the catch. It would have, far too damaging of an impact to keep everyone sustainable. 35 years ago, fisheries managers chose a 1/32 increase to be less impactful to harvesters. At that time, we never even imagined expenses would be as high as they are today. And I just asked you to take into consideration that 10% reduction in landings equates to much more than 10% reduction on the bottom lines if some of us, completely don't make it. I asked the commission to please consider a 1-year pause if any action must be taken at that point. Smaller, more frequent increases like a 32nd of an inch at one time would be easier pill to swallow. Please think about the hundreds of young fishermen in the industry who are starting out with high debt and low profit margins. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate it. Since we started open the conversations up, we've had two more come on, John Druin and John Norton. I'm going to go to John Druin, but I'm going to ask you to keep your comments very brief because we've blown through the 30 minutes that we set aside for this. So, John Druin, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can. Can you hear me now?
I got you, John. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to say my name is John Druin. I am a lobster fisherman from Cutler, Maine. Have been for 45 years, and Cutler is the epicenter of the gray zone. The gray zone is a body of water that's 210 square nautical miles that is shared by the Americans and Canadians. The Canadians claim to within 3.5 miles, 3.5 miles is where the Canadians fish off of Cutler Harbor. Addendum 27 will provide 0 conservation benefits in this area, which affects fishermen from Eastport down through Jonesport and beyond. So whatever you're looking for like it says, conservation benefits are going to be null and void in this area. Goes hand in hand with Addendum 30 as well. If Canadians retain these lobsters that we don't, it's just another slap in our face as they go to market for lobsters that we cannot retain. So I'd love to spend some more time and talk to you about the gray zone, and perhaps in the future we can. Thank you.
And last up for public comments, John Norton. John?
John?
Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for recognizing me. I'll try to make this brief.
Thank you.
I'm concerned with the interplay between Addendum 27 and 30. The U.S. processing industry sector relies on supplies of Canadian lobsters during May and June. If those lobsters from Canada are diverted from the U.S. the survivability of U.S. processors is at risk. That supply probably is 90% of U.S. processing in those months. Without those months, we would not be able to cover overhead for the year. I think it would produce a tremendous hollowing out of the lobster processing industry in the U.S. If that happens, we'd be left in the situation we were in 2012, when a supply shock hit the U.S. industry. We had strikes. We had $1.75 a pound, and I don't want to go back to those days.
Thank you, John. I appreciate those comments. That concludes the comment period for items not on the agenda. So at this time, we're going to jump right into the agenda, but I just remind the board that I've got a few comments as it pertains to some of the things that we've heard here today at the end of the meeting. So item number 4 is a progress update on the benchmark stock assessment for American Lobster. So Tracy, take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. So this is going to be really quick. We have essentially just started the stock assessment process, and I'm going to give you a 2-slide quickie. So your subcommittee members for this are Kathleen Reardon from Maine, Josh Carloni from New Hampshire, myself from Massachusetts, Burton Shank from National Marine Fisheries Service, Connor McManus from Rhode Island, and Jeff Kipp from ASMFC. We are receiving additional support this time around from a couple of external researchers. Dr. Teresa Burnham with the University of Maine is helping us out with some socioeconomics information. And Dr. Jenny Neslage from the University of Maryland is going to be heavily involved in helping us update our growth information for this assessment. Essentially where we're at is we had a 3-day data workshop in February. A lot of that was focused on bringing in outside information, learning from folks outside of the assessment committee on what they're doing and how their information might be relevant for the assessment process, or just simply understanding life history updates. We have also initiated the modeling crew is having bi-weekly phone calls at this point in time to discuss updates and status on progress on the modeling work. We've had our first webinar on April 19th, and so our future schedule is we have another webinar on June 3rd. We have a multi-day meeting coming up in July that is scheduled to meet in New Bedford, Mass. We have another multi-day meeting coming up this fall sometime. The location is to be determined. The other bits of the schedule are we plan to have a draft report ready for the technical committee to review by February of 25. The peer review workshop then will hopefully take place in May of 2025. And the final presentation to the board of the completed and reviewed assessment, we're hoping will be in August of 2025. And I will happily take any questions if anybody has any about this.
Any questions for Tracy on the update? Seeing none, then we are going to go right along to item number 5, which is a technical committee report on the northern edge. So back to Tracy.
Okay, so I'm also going to go relatively quickly through this. So the background on this is in with respect to a potential New England Fisheries Management Council action looking into opening up scallop access to a portion of closed area 2 on the northeast portion of Georges Bank. There's a specific area of interest. Essentially, there's a closed habitat management area in that region, and they're looking at providing scallop access to a portion of this habitat management area. So on the map here, essentially, this is just where we're talking about. This is all in NIMS statistical area 561. The yellow here on the map is that habitat management area. And the pink and the black slashes in this map show essentially 2 of the proposed scallop access areas. They were considering 4 access areas. My understanding is that as of their meeting in April, they have reduced the areas they're considering down to just 2 areas. The pink area on this is one of those areas, and I think it's the upper portion of the pink is one area, and then the full portion of that pink is another area that they're still considering. My understanding is that the council is going to be looking for updated information in June, and potentially taking action in September. And again, this is my understanding of the council process. So the task from the board to the TC was to characterize potential impacts to the lobster population and fishery relative to presence and absence of lobsters, particularly egg-bearing females, and then also take a look at fishing effort in the area. We gave a little bit of information update to the board in January, and this presentation essentially summarizes the final report that we provided to you in meeting materials. So the data sources that we've used for this, fishery independent surveys to look at relative abundance and population characteristics. So the Science Center's spring and fall trawl surveys. We went back to the year 2000 with these data and looking at catch, station-specific catch locations on and off the bank. The Coonamessett Farm Foundation generously gave us data access to a seasonal scallop dredge survey that they've been conducting since 2012. For the relative abundance and population characteristics, we looked specifically at a subset of their data that happens up on top of the bank and that has sufficient sampling resolution to let us look at seasonality. Fishery dependent data gave us some information about catch characterization, so the kind of catch that we were seeing in commercial traps, size, sex ratio, reproductive status. We have data from the CFRF's lobster study fleet on this going back to 2013. And those data were constrained specifically to the scallop access areas being proposed. And we also have a little bit of data from the Federal Observer Program, just a couple years worth of data there. For additional fishery dependent data in 2015, AOLA and New Hampshire Fish and Game did a harvester logbook survey where they were taking information from harvesters. We used that to look at distribution of egg-bearing females. There's a tagging study available to look at lobster movements around the bank. And then we use VTR data, Federal Troop Report data to look at lobster effort and landings. We looked at both within statistical area 561 on and off the bank, and we tried to look at it a little bit finer resolution on 10-minute square levels. And then finally, again, from the CFF seasonal scallop dredge survey, we can look at the impact of scallop gear on lobsters themselves. So the seasonality and abundance, the graphs here on the left, you see the spring survey data. On the right is the fall survey. Notice the scale difference in the points on these graphics. So the spring survey catch is topping out at about 50 lobsters per tow, whereas the fall is topping out at about 300 lobsters per tow. So even though the dots in the spring look bigger, the catch in the spring is actually a little bit lower than fall overall. And you can see there's a seasonal pattern. So the higher catches in the spring are off the bank, whereas in the fall, the higher catches are up on the bank. The highest catch that we saw in either season is in that habitat management area in the green. So that big blue dot was over 300 lobsters in that tow. For seasonality, this is the scallop dredge survey 2017 to 2019 data. Again, this was a subset that was happening specifically up on top of the bank. And you can see a pretty consistent seasonal pattern here in the catch with the winter to spring being relatively low, it increases. And so we see the highest catch rates then in that August to October time period before it drops off again in December. For sizes and sex ratio on the left, this is from the trawl survey, the federal trawl survey, and I'm only showing you a portion of the graphic that's included in your final report. So this is just the on-bank portion of the graphic from the final report. And the top is fall, the bottom is spring, the red is females, the blue is males. On the right, the graph is from the scallop dredge survey. Again, females are in red, males are in blue. Both of these mobile gear surveys are showing us a very strong female skewed sex ratio, particularly in the fall. And then we're seeing predominantly larger lobsters. Again, predominantly this is happening in the fall time period. And then we looked at the scallop dredge survey data, and 57% of those females were egg-bearing females. So from commercial catch data, so this is commercial lobster catch data. This lobster study fleet, this is data constrained specifically to those scallop access proposed areas. We did see year-round fishing activity in those areas in many of the years that we looked at. And again, this goes back to 2013. The graphic for the size is included in your report. I'm not showing it here, but we are seeing a fair number of large lobsters comprising the catch from these commercial catch data. Looking at the stability of that size distribution over time, females are pretty stable throughout the 3 or the 4 seasons, whereas males, the size distribution is a little bit larger in the fall and the winter, a little bit smaller in spring and summer. When we look at sex ratio, the graph here is showing an actual ratio. So if you look, like 10 in this graph is 10 females to 1 male. So you can see in the 4 seasons, we're seeing relatively consistent female skew all seasons over all of the years that we looked at. And particularly in the spring and summer, which is when most of the actual observations were happening. Q2 is seeing annually more than 10 females for every male. And in Q3, which is July through September, we've got several years where we're seeing that high skew of 10 to 1, and that's about 90% or so female. The bottom graph here shows reproductive status over sizes. So the x-axis is lobster size. And in the black, you can see the proportion of females with eggs. This does tend to increase with female size. The highest proportions were observed in Q1 catch, but this is sort of the lowest overall total lobsters observed. The lowest proportions of egg-bearing females were observed in Q2 here. For commercial sizes and sex ratio, this is from the Federal Observer data. Again, relatively limited. This is only from 2013 to 2015 with available data. And again, I'm only showing you a portion of the figure that's included in your final report. Most of the catch that was observed through this program actually was taking place off the bank, but what I'm showing on the screen here is on the bank catch. You can see essentially we're only getting catch observations from June through October. June, the catch was relatively sporadic, but in July, catch rates picked up. And so you can start to see a good size distribution here. The females are in black and in orange. Black shows females with eggs, orange is no eggs. Males are in blue. You can see there's relatively high catch rates of lobsters above 100 millimeters in most months. 100 millimeters is about 4 inches carapace length. Again, we see this in particularly the females. And if you look specifically at October, you can see that the catch is dominated by egg-bearing females from about 88 to about 110 millimeters size. So we used the Harvester Logbook program to look at the distribution of egg-bearing females. This happened in 2015, and they looked at over 13,000 trap hauls, over 48,000 total lobsters, 19,051 of those were ovigerous females. And so you can see the broader distribution is in the graph here, but you can see 2 concentrations of high proportions of egg-bearing females. One of those is right up on top of the bank. And we do see some very high proportions of egg-bearing females in what would be the southernmost portion of that habitat management area. The colored boxes in this aren't quite in alignment with the current habitat management area because this is an older proposed regions, but they're very close, so it gives you a good idea of where those egg-bearing females are in relation to the current proposed habitat management area and scallop closures. Movement data. So a couple caveats with the movement data. So first, these are predominantly discarded lobsters from commercial catch. So we're talking about egg-bearing females, V-notch females, and undersized lobsters make up most of what they tagged. And again, this kind of tagging data, specifically offshore, is very dependent on where commercial fishing activity is actually taking place. So both in terms of lobsters available to tag and release and in terms of recaptures. So we've broken down these maps by the release time period. This Q1 here is the winter releases, and recaptures happened at any point in time. You can see there's not a lot of activity here. The red on this graph shows one of the proposed scallop access areas for reference. So Q1, we see a little bit of recapture happening up on top of the bank. If we move to Q2, we've got more activity happening, and you can see in the northernmost portion of one of the scallop proposed areas, we are seeing activity. So this means both fleet fishing activity and lobster activity happening. Q3 is the summer period. You can see there's a fair amount of activity up on top of the bank here and a little bit of activity in the northernmost portion of the scallop access areas that are proposed. Q4 is fall. Again, lots of activity up on top of the bank in terms of both fleet and recaptures, and a little bit of activity in the northernmost portion of that scallop proposed area. So for catch and landings and effort data, again, this is VTR data. We took a look at this and we're pretty sure that the VTRs going back to 2013 specifically for this region actually do capture most of the trips happening. So we looked at the VTR data on two sort of levels of resolution within statistical area 561. So the big gray box there is all of 561. The green is that habitat management area, and the black outline is one of the proposed scallop areas. The blue dashed line here is the 100-meter depth fathom, which is essentially, or depth contour, which is what we're using to delineate on and off the bank. So we looked at it both on and off the bank and then at the 10-minute square level for this. We have a lot more confidence in the data at the 561 scale than we do at the 10-minute square. This is because of the way the VTR data are reported. Fishers on VTRs tend to report a single lat long on the VTR, so it doesn't necessarily represent the specific location of all of the trawls that they hauled in that trip. It's just the one specific area. So we don't think it fully captures the full footprint of where activity is happening. But with that said, the graphs here show on the top the number of active vessels, the bottom is landings. The blue line here is off of the bank and the red line is, I'm sorry, the blue is on bank and the red is off bank. And so you can see that activity on the bank and landings on the bank increase in July. The number of vessels is highest from July through October. And the landings show a pretty clear peak in August, but are generally high from July through October. And landings on the bank do account for a pretty good proportion of the annual landings in Area 561 as a whole. So looking at the 10-minute square level, again, this is where we have slightly less confidence that the spatial resolution is really accurate, but you do see the seasonal pattern. So the first 6 months of the year, essentially, we see all of the activity in terms of landings happening in the deeper water off of the bank. And then the landings start to pick up as you get into July through October. Most of those landings seem to be happening immediately south of the scallop area. So the bright yellow box there is the highest in the landing scale that we're showing here. And then landings within the access areas are considered essentially a small to moderate amount of the monthly landings at this resolution. So finally, the impact of scallop gear on lobsters, and this is the physical impact of the gear on the lobsters. For this, we were able to use the full data set from the Coonamessett Farm Scallop Dread Survey. So going back to 2012, they observed 2,060 females and 216 males. Of those, only 37% of those females were undamaged and only 31% of those males were undamaged. And that's shown in the pie graphs on the left. If you look at that, the orange and the red essentially are moderate and lethal damage respectively. So you can see the fair amount of females and males experienced at least moderate, if not lethal damage. Egg-bearing females seem to be more robust to this gear. 45% of the egg-bearing females were undamaged versus only 27% of non-egg-bearing females were undamaged. We think this is likely because those egg-bearing females have had that shell on for a really long time. So the shell is actually very hard at that point. And particularly molted lobsters or recently molted lobsters seem to be particularly vulnerable. 73% of recently molted lobsters had lethal damage. 33.5% of hard shell lobsters had lethal damage. When we looked at a model to try to incorporate size into this analysis, again, I'm only showing you a part of the graphic that's available in your final report. So this is for the lobsters that did not have eggs. The model is predicting major damage being extremely high. So the blue line here is the major damage, and you can see specifically for the paper shell lobsters, it's upwards of 90% of lobsters are going to have major damage. And there does appear to be a size component here. So the model predicted increase in major damage as you got above about 110 millimeters. And you can see this in the hard shell graph there with the line ticking upwards at those larger sizes. So to summarize, lobsters do appear to be present year-round on the bank, but relative abundance is much higher in the late summer to the fall time period. Large aggregations of ovigerous females do appear on top of the bank. From the data that we have, this seems to happen sort of in and immediately south of that habitat management area. The lobsters that we're seeing are very large, mostly over 100 millimeters, and this is consistent across the various data sources. So we're getting this from commercial trap gear, we're getting this from survey gear. We're getting this from scallop dredge gear. And similarly, female skewed sex ratios are pretty consistent across all the available data sources. We do see moderate levels of fishing activity from July through November in the habitat management area, so in the closed area. There appears to at least be some overlap with the proposed scallop access areas. And again, on-bank fishing does contribute a relatively large portion of landings for 561 as a whole. And one thing I wanted to point out here, because I've essentially complained about the resolution in the spatial data with the VTRs, is the implementation of the tracker data will eventually let us answer questions like this with much better confidence, because it's going to have that better precision to be able to address specific areas of interest. So I will happily answer any questions anyone has.
Thank you, Tracy. That's an excellent report. Before we consider taking any action, does anybody have any questions for Tracy? Mr. Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellent presentation, Tracy. Fine job as always. I guess my question is there a divergence between the tracker data that the Commonwealth has since they implemented trackers early and the VTRs?
So we did look briefly at the tracker data that's existing. As Dave mentioned, it's only Massachusetts that had more than essentially a couple of months of data to look at. There are a number of issues with the first year of the data being as implemented. There were some issues with the devices and things, but there's nothing in the tracker data that essentially says something different from what the VTR data are showing us. So the tracker data that we do have available corroborates the VTR data.
Yeah, the follow-up, Mr. Chairman's view, it's a process question. As I understand the time sequence, I'm sitting next to the chair of the New England Council. Council isn't going to finalize its position until later in the summer. And we have a summer meeting that takes place prior to that. In other words, there's some uncertainty as to which of these two alternatives, the council is going to utilize. So the question is the intent here to offer some general comments on this proposal at this time and then get into the specifics at the summer meeting, or are we going to try to do it all at this meeting?
Yeah, I think from the timing with the council meeting, I think it would be more appropriate for this board to consider making some final comments on this for the council to have under their consideration. But Eric Reed.
Yeah, aloha to you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. Yeah, at this point, what happened in New England a couple of weeks ago is we did receive a summary report from Ms. Kearns, but we didn't have this final report yet. We are scheduled to have an update at the end of June in our council meeting, which is the end of June, but there will be some amount of work done before then. And there will be an update, and final action is proposed for September. But if you wait until your summer meeting, what's the point of waiting? I guess that's my question to you, Mr. Chair. You have the information available to you now. That is not going to change. So that's my 2 cents. And
yeah,
the report you did was actually really awesome, and your timing was perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Reed. Yeah, I concur with that. I mean, I think we do have a very excellent report from the TC on this topic, and I think what we need to consider finalizing a letter at this point in time to send to the council. But before we get to that point, I got to see if I know I've got Steve Train and then Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tracy, I'm sure you've got anecdotal data from other stuff out there. This is what you were tasked to study, and I'm getting numbers like 57%, mostly large lobsters, 50%, 57% are egg bearing, 88% are female in one area, 34% egg bearing. Larger lobsters, 34.3% that were hit by a drag of females died, 46% of males died. Is this typical population data out there, or does this area just have a lot more females with eggs?
So we think that Georges Bank in general has a relatively unique population of relatively large, and the egg-bearing females, obviously there's seasonality to that. So if you look in the middle of summer after they've all hatched, you're going to have very low proportions of egg-bearing females. But if you look in the wintertime or in the fall after they've spawned and while they're carrying those eggs, it's going to go really high. So to some extent, the timing of the sampling dictates what we're really seeing with proportion of egg-bearing females. But we do think that this is an important area for egg-bearing females and large sizes. I think the available data out there, we were a little bit honestly lucky in that CFF has such an extensive presence out there with their scallop dread surveys that we could look at that data. The Federal Observer data was limited to just those 2 years or 3 years, 2013, 14, and 15 that we had available to look at. And then the CFRF study fleet provides a really important data source for us to be able to use out there. So it's not necessarily a data-rich area, but we do have these pieces of information. Does that address your question?
I think mostly, yes. It sounds like pretty much most of Georgia's is like that, but this might be a little heavier, maybe because of the time of year. Is that oversimplification of what you said?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a timing component to it, but yeah, we do think up on top of Georges Bank is a relatively unique population of lobsters.
Paula, you said it's a relatively unique, but didn't we just determine a few years ago that Georges Bank and the Gulf of Maine are the same lobster stock?
Yeah, the 2015 stock assessment did tie the Georges Bank stock to the Gulf of Maine stock. That was based largely on looking at some of the trawl survey indices and looking at the exchange of lobsters on top of the bank and down off into the deeper water, the seasonality of that exchange. And then there's older tagging data and then this newer tagging data. We're going to look at that really closely with this upcoming stock assessment to revisit that linkage. But it does, so it's unique in that there's very large lobsters out there. It's not necessarily disconnected from the Gulf of Maine stock as a whole. So that's something that we are going to take another close look at with this stock assessment.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Steve. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if you would allow the opinion of someone well from the south of this fishery area. In the documents that were provided, it isn't at all clear to me whether this fishery is going to happen, and we're just providing guidance on where, how, and when, as opposed to perhaps this fishery not taking place in the area for all the reasons we've already heard concerning ovigerous females, et cetera. So some guidance for the rest of us would be beneficial, Mr. Chairman, or perhaps Tracy, if you could enlighten us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roy. So presently, the New England Fisheries Management Council is considering four areas for considering opening on the northern edge for scallop fishing. They have been working to narrow those areas down within their documentation. But the idea here is to provide additional guidance to the council on whether those areas should be opened or not, or modified. So it will ultimately be a New England Council action. I'll turn to Chairman Reed to see if he'd like to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's actually at our June meeting, we eliminated 2 of the 4 areas that have been under consideration. The 2 that are left, in one of your charts, you showed a little piece of a carrot of really complex bottom. Both the areas that are still on the table are, generally speaking, north of that complex bottom out into deeper water, outside of 55, 80 fathoms of water, out in deeper water. And one of the areas, area 2, is completely enclosed in area 4. So just so you know, we're down to 2 areas, plus the option, of course, is status quo, no action. That is also it's not a foregone conclusion, Roy, but we're working on it.
Roy, does that answer your question?
It provides me some guidance, if not total comfort anyway.
Okay. Thank you, Roy. Before I go to Jeff Kalin, Tony Kearns had, okay, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been involved in this process since I was on the Mid-Atlantic Council. I'm still a habitat advisor, and I think there's some real opportunity to go into at least one of the 2 areas that we're left on the table at the council meeting in June. So my question is, Tracy, appreciate the presentation. And I don't think you've done the work yet, but it seems to me that what we need is some kind of a relative comparison about gear impact mortality outside of that area, generally in the, scallop gear impacts to lobsters, bottom trawl impact to lobster gear damage, compared to what you just showed us on George's. I really think that we need a comparative, we need to compare the potential damage on George's, the narrow areas that we want to go into for scalloping up there, relative to the rest of the fisheries, both the bottom trawl and the scallop fisheries relative to gear mortality. So we have some kind of a comparison to make to determine relative risk and so forth. So I want to make that point. That might be very complex, but it seems to me that kind of information would be very important.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, with the CFF data available, the scallop dredge surveys that they were doing, some of those took place on top of the bank and some of them were taking place in deeper waters off of the bank. We pulled the data for what I showed you here. We did look at on and off the bank. I don't remember seeing a difference in terms of where that gear was towing on the bank versus off the bank in terms of the damages. We can dig a little bit further into that. As far as I know, I can't think of any, certainly nothing recent or nothing offshore for other mobile gear types that would have damage assessments or damage rates. I think that there's probably some very old information inshore with mobile gear. And I'm squinting because I can't really remember for sure. I want to say it was in the 80s. But, inshore is going to be smaller lobsters, a little bit of different habitat. So we don't have a lot of comparative stuff to work with. But we can dig a little bit more into the CFF data if you'd like us to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking particularly around the rest of Georgia's or the southern end of the western as an area, but it's not a perfect world. We may not be able to make that comparison, but it does strike me as important just in terms of relative risk in going onto Georgia's to scallop fish. So thank you for considering that anyway.
Thanks, Jeff. Dennis, did you have your hand up? No. Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one of the things, and thank you, Tracy, for this very thorough report from the TC. One thing that we did not ask the TC to do was to provide any economic information on what potential impacts would be. And I think that'll be really important for the council to have that information as they are contemplating their decision. And I think that data is important to have as they develop their document. So that information would be needed prior to our August meeting and as soon as possible. Because VTRs were not fully implemented until April 1st, we're not going to be able to get economic data from the VTR reports aren't going to have economic data. So then you have to go to the dealer reports, and the dealer reports won't be tied to the VTRs until just now, most likely. And so we're going to have to piecemeal together any economic data that we need, but it would be helpful for the board to direct us to do that as we are providing information over to the council to the best of our abilities. And we may need the states to help us piecemeal that together with the data that you all have to provide the best information possible.
Okay, well, we had a complicated issue. It's even more complicated. Thanks, Tony. Appreciate that. Any additional questions for Tracy? Seeing no additional comments for Tracy, would anybody like to make any motions here? David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to make a motion yet, but it seems like what we first have to decide is whether or not we want to submit a letter, and I assume we do.
Correct.
And then, to me, the process should be, we should raise issues, and then then the staff can have the luxury of a little bit of time to put together a letter and circulate it to the board to ensure that it reflects the sentiment that's been expressed. Is that the gist of the process that you envision?
Yeah, thank you, David. Eric Reed, if I could direct a question to you, just from a timing perspective. If a letter was going to be sent, what do you envision as far as the deadline? What's the latest we could get a letter to the council to have it be impactful?
Well, honestly, Mr. Chairman, it would really depend on when the two committees will meet, the SCALP committee and the Habitat committees will meet to consider any additional information. Obviously, we'll have this report to consider, but if there is some other something from the commission, the longer it takes you to get that in play, the less likely it is that it will be really considered. I mean, we will obviously consider this final report in our decision-making process, but the report speaks for itself.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Dan McKernan.
Just in terms of process, I think it would be valuable if the board also cleared the TC to maybe submit whatever future work product is going to happen to the council staff, because if we have to wait to receive a report in August before we hand it on, I'm guessing that there's some time sensitive aspects to this, and we ran into a time or sequencing challenge where there was request to get this report to the council before we had even seen it, but it's obvious to me that is important in order to get this data incorporated into council decision making. So whatever we do, I think we should allow the TC, maybe with executive director or board chair oversight, to get this data into the process.
Thank you, Dan. I think the additional data that we might need if we did want to pull together economic data, obviously, I think we'd need some TC work and some work from the states, as Tony said. But I think to where Dave Borden was going, the idea of staff potentially starting the drafting process on a letter, if that's where you were going, let me ask the question to the board. Is there any objections to sending a letter outlining the concerns that have been raised with the data that the TC has provided us? Allie Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Great. I'm really appreciative of the work that the technical committee has done, and certainly fully support information sharing. I just abstain from any opinions that or input or recommendations that the board wants to make to the council. Thank you.
Thanks for that clarity, Allie. Sheree.
Just a question on what sort of data we would probably like to see analyzed, not just the landings aspect, but also what the cost of the damage would be to lobsters if mobile gear was going through there. So it would be the potential resource there, not just what is being removed for landings.
Thank you, Sheree. Steve Train.
I would object to a letter going out that says anything other than hell no. I mean, we've got broodstock lobsters out there that have more eggs, healthier eggs, more likely of sustainability. That's part of a stock that is the same stock that we're trying to manage, that we got a room full of people and a room full of people online because they're worried about the management of a stock that's stressed. I don't know why we would worry about sending a letter. Anything that doesn't say hell no, we're wasting our time.
Thank you for that clarity, Mr. Train. I think if there is Dave Borden.
I'll make this brief. It's my understanding that some of the data that's available is confidential and can't be released. And so the technical committee is in the, I think, the position where they can't use that data and put that data into any kind of document that we would submit. The one option I think that the commission has is it can go to those individuals that submitted the data, the confidential data, and ask them whether or not they'll agree to release them, so we can use it. And I think that step should be included in the process. We need to use the best data that we have to characterize the problem, and if that requires us to get special permission from the people that submitted the data, then I think we should do that. And then I've got a general statement I'd like to make after you get to that point.
Thank you, David. Is there any other comments on this? Doug Grout.
Yeah, I think our process of developing the comments is a good one, but I agree with Steve that the major issue here that we've seen, not just from this most recent data that the TC had put up, but we saw information from a previous action that indicated there was a large number of egg-bearing females on the bank during the summer and fall, and that the impact by scallop dredges, which is what this action is looking at providing access to, was very significant. And it's again shown here by the most recent data. I don't think we need to compare it with what it looks like in other mobile gears. We know that there is some past information on that. And I think the only refinement we might have to look at is what are the specific areas that are now still under consideration, and if any of those areas does have, the locations have some mitigating impact to what scholar, if there aren't that many females in those particular areas, or whether it's whether they still are impacted. I mean, that it's to me, the key thing here is the impact to ovigerous females up there, which seem to be in high concentrations.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, the tasking motion for the TC was something that I put on the table, and it really kind of aligned with the concerns that you're raising now. And I think with the TC has given us a very good report to base the development of a letter on. And then if I think to Dan McKernan's point, if there's any additional information that may come from the TC at a later date, we could either add to with some general discretion of the board chair and the director. But I'm going to turn it over to Dave Borden for a statement. Maybe we can get to a motion or at least a consensus statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're on the horns of a dilemma on this issue. I totally agree with the statement that Commissioner Train just made, and I won't be as eloquent, but the problem is this commission has a responsibility to kind of set the direction for lobster management. This is a $1 billion fishery that employs probably 30,000 people up and down the coast. The inshore stock and the offshore stock are connected. We have an excellent technical committee, the best in my entire career, I would point out. And that stock is all considered one stock. So we're dealing with one stock. So on the one hand, we're basically telling the inshore fishermen, you have to sacrifice, you have to increase spawning stock biomass on the inshore areas, and you're gonna lose some landings. And I've been a supporter of that because I want to buffer the coastal communities, particularly up in eastern Maine, that are 90% reliant on this resource. A 50% decline in the resource is a disaster And we may not be able to stop it, but one thing we can do, having been a state fishery director during the collapse of the Southern New England stock, is we didn't take action soon enough. I've said this repeatedly. You have to get out in front of this issue. So some action is required. So on the other hand, the New England Council is primarily responsible for setting the direction on scallops, and they've got to weigh those impacts. The damage rates that Tracy and the technical folks indicated are substantial. They're nothing for us to turn a blind eye to in the process. So I think we have to send a pretty forceful letter to the commission and raise those types of concerns. One of the concerns and I'm going back to 2002 when I was a council member. I got off the council in 2004, but in 2002. NOAA approved the habitat amendment, and they disapproved certain parts of that habitat amendment. And if my memory is correct, they were specifically required that if habitat was going to be negatively affected, that there had to be mitigation steps proposed as part of that process. Now, that's 20 years ago. My memory may be wrong, but I think that NOAA General Counsel has to clearly look at the provisions they included in the habitat approval and insist that those conditions on mitigation be met on this. So, and from my perspective, is this going to be a scallop fishery? I think scallopers, and I totally understand the logic of why they want to get in there. But if there's going to be a scallop fishery, we have to do something to mitigate the negative consequences on the lobster stock. Otherwise, it makes absolutely no sense to tell the inshore guys, you got to sacrifice and raise the gauge in order to increase SSB so somebody else can kill it in another area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Borden. Jeff Kalen, we are constrained for time, so I'll ask you to make a quick comment or question, and then I'm going to come back. You've got your hand up too, Ray. Ray, you got to raise it high so I can see it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So mitigation is on the table. That is definitely one of the issues that the scallop industry is going to have to do with that initiative up there. But I'm looking at the data, and I think April, May, June, July, November, December, there's opportunity to go in that area, that specific area that's still on the table. And I have a real problem with a hell no, personally, based on my years of experience up there on Georges and so forth. So I think that's an unfair characterization of the data, frankly. I think there's an opportunity to go in there with minimal impacts during the spring. And that's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Ray King.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Tracy, for an excellent presentation. Hearing the conversation, I concur with other commission members here with what Steve Train had to say, what Dave Borden had to say. I think in this letter to the council, it should be mentioned, as Jeff Kalen just spoke to, it should be a time area closure. You know, December through March, have at it. They're big vessels, you know, they're going to come back with the safety issue. But if there are scallops there, harvestable scallops, give them access. But in a time when it's not going to impact our lobster industry. I mean, we do manage lobster, right? I mean, this table, ASMSC manages lobster. And I think we have to let the council know right off that it's out of question, a year-round fishery out there. They have to start thinking much smaller, like 3 or 4 months of the year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I really appreciated Steve Crane's comment because I like the plain spoken word. Hell no. You know, there's a big difference in sending our concerns to the council, but I think that we either should be opposing this measure or supporting it. And, you know, after listening to Tracy talk about the damage there, it was really an eye opener for someone like me. And I think I would like to see us as a board take a vote, have a motion and take a vote on whether we want to say that we're the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Lobster Board is in favor of or opposed to. So I think, you know, we should know where the board stands. So I really like to see a vote taken on which way we want to go. And as Steve said, you know, after he said it, hell no, I think that's the proper way to go.
Thank you, Dennis. There is no motion on the table. We do have a very detailed technical committee report that speaks to the data. It speaks to time and area issues associated with it. We're here, as was said by Mr. Kane, to give our comments as it pertains to the impact to the lobster resource. So it would be appropriate for us to send a letter to that point. If there is a motion that would like, if anybody would like to make a motion, we can entertain it. If not, I think we need to, by consensus, have staff draft a letter that includes the details from the technical committee report. And if we have time, do some additional outreach to the states on what that economic impact would be. That would give us all of the information, or excuse me, it would give the council all of the information. They would have that technical committee report. They would have that data all around the economics of the situation for them to then use for final consideration in front of that management body. So if nobody wants to make a motion, I would ask if there is consensus with that approach that I just laid out. Mr. Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Absent of a motion and any consensus statement, I am the chairman of the New England Council, and I'm also the chairman of the Habitat Committee, so I'm going to abstain on whatever it is you're going to do here.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Seeing no, Tony.
Just as a FYI, we've already shared the report with council staff, so they do have the report already.
They do?
Yeah.
Is there consensus on developing a letter that highlights the concerns within the TC report? The letter could be drafted for my review and the executive director's review. And we would then send it to the council once we have the additional economic information from the state. We have consensus on that approach. Is there any opposition to that approach? Seeing none, we will develop a letter based on the information that we have and then try to include that economic information that Tony raised. So thank you very much. We're going to move right along to item number 6. I know Caitlin can probably be a little briefer than I'd hoped on the last agenda item. So the plan development team report on conservation measures for areas 2 and 3. Caitlin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will try to be brief. So just for the background on this topic, this is related to the 2023 NOAA interim rule to implement the measures from addenda 21 and 22. These 2 addenda were approved in 2013, and they included aggregate ownership caps in LCMAs 2 and 3, and a maximum trap cap reductions in LCMA 3. And at that time, these measures were intended to scale the southern New England fishery to the size of the stock, which had been found depleted in the last stock assessment. And then given that 10-year delay between 2013 and the federal implementation of these measures in addenda 21 and 22, the board and industry have expressed concerns that in that time, there have been some significant changes in the fishery. So as a result, the board thought it was warranted to investigate this further, and they tasked the PDT to review the conservation measures that were originally set in addenda 21 and 22 and to come up with some recommendations for alternative measures to achieve the same types of conservation measures, inclusive of input from the Lobster Conservation Management Team for Area 2 and Area 3 by the spring meeting. So I will note here that because the LCMT for Area 3 has not met yet, the PDT was unable to provide recommendations that consider LCMT input for this meeting. But the PDT did meet twice in April, and the discussions that the PDTs had focused mainly on gathering information that could help characterize the changes that have occurred in the lobster fishery in southern New England since 2013. The PDT discussed the number of permits issued by LCMA and maximum allocations, number of traps fished, development of the Jonah crab fishery, and the shift of Area 3 vessels from southern New England to fishing in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock as issues that need to be quantified to better understand how the fishery has changed in this time period. And with the data that were available to the PDT before now, we had data from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and also on federal permits, and the PDT was able to put that together in time for this meeting. And these are some of the key takeaways that the PDT noted with these data. So between 2010 and 2023, there was a 42% reduction in the LCMA2 maximum allocation. It should be noted that not all jurisdictions had data available for this time frame. And there was a 38% reduction in the LCMA2 maximum traps fished between 2013 and 2022. There was a 28% reduction in the LCMA3 allocation between 2013 and 2023. And then a 4.3% reduction in the LCMA3 max traps fished between 2013 and 2022. But that metric was relatively steady over that time period. So moving forward, the PDT has identified some gaps in the data that they'd like to be filled in order to complete this task. And that includes federal LCMA3 allocation data for 2008 forward, some missing LCMA2 allocation data for the years of 2011 to 2015, and the LCMA3 permit and trap data separated out by stock area. And with the full data set, the PDT plans to look into overall reductions in maximum traps fished, changes in the ratio of max traps fished to allocations over time, and reductions in traps actively fished, and then quantifying the change in Jonah crab directed effort in southern New England. And once both the LCMTs have met and provided some recommendations as well for achieving the conservation goals from Addenda 21 and 22, the PDT can take that input into consideration as well. And in addition, the PDT also is looking for some additional guidance from the board to help them focus the recommendations. The PDT felt the language of the Addenda 21 and 22 objectives is a little bit vague, so it would be helpful for the board to weigh in on what metrics should be used to evaluate this idea of scaling the fishery. So for example, should we be looking at total traps or allocations in proportion to relative abundance of the stock, or number of trap hauls? Additionally, the PDT is looking for input on what specific objectives the PDT's recommendations should aim to achieve, whether that's eliminating latent effort or achieving long-term reductions in traps fished, or preventing increases in effort from current levels, or something else. So these are some things the PDT would like some input on from the board today. And before we go back to the board for discussion, I believe we have a report from the LCMT2 meeting that took place this month.
Connor McManus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief because there's a memo or report in your materials as well outlining the meeting that we had on April 9th regarding the topic for LCMT2. Many of the comments that were made were similar to those that have been expressed in other avenues and other workshops we've held as of late, but just in brief, the LCMT for Area 2 first commented on the sunset clause of May 1st, 2022, and that they would be interested in trying to change that or remove it entirely to try and enhance flexibility for the fishery. Much of the comments today have been around the topic of how much the lobster fishery has changed in southern New England, particularly in this area, and it's imperative to try and provide enhanced flexibility where possible, of which changing the sunset clause to something different or removing it altogether would be a step in that direction. There was a similar sentiment of that and justification for discussing the trap limit for federal permit holders with 2 permits and trying to allow for that second permit to be have 800 traps and not be capped at whatever they were at the date of that sunset date. There was, again, aligning with the idea of business flexibility for this fishery that's changed a lot, but also preparing businesses if there were further management actions that were surrounding trap reductions as there have been in previous years for this stock. It was noted that in order to even build a permit back up with traps, that it'd be necessary oftentimes to buy multiple permits to try and build to some number, given the current trap numbers for permits federally right now. So to try and enhance that flexibility again, there was discussion about whether two permits or 3 permits or something where there's a trap limit, or is the unit traps or permits now in terms of how we think about federal permit holders right currently with this element. So there was a lot of discussion about thinking of how the fishery will look moving forward, and their recommendations for how to think about those elements. There were additional comments related to ultimately like the alignment between state and federal waters licensed individuals, and there was sentiment from LCMT2 members to have state license holders and federal permit holders be aligned in this discussion. And there was a final request to try and solidify where possible everywhere what is meant by entity, which is something we've discussed, or you've all discussed at length currently. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. But again, it was a brief report. I will note that the LCMT2 plans to meet again to further refine their opinions or clear requests or guidance to the board. Thanks.
Thank you, Connor. Based on the report from Caitlin and additional information from Connor, it's certainly clear that some additional information is going to be needed and guidance from the board. Caitlin, do you want to put that slide up for where you need additional board guidance? But I'm just going to kind of wing it here a little bit. If there's any questions or comments for either Caitlin or Connor, or if there's any additional guidance that the board would like to take, I'm open for any of that right now. I see have any hands? Clearly additional guidance is being asked for here. Okay. I'm not sure how we're going to move forward without additional guidance on this particular topic. They've met on this issue. There seems to be some, we do have a hand. Dan McKernan, thank you for bailing me out.
So the Area 3 LCMT didn't meet, and I want to take full blame for that, or credit. But I really think the PDT is on the right track in terms of describing through analysis of effort data where we're at. And I'm really comfortable presenting some of those data back to Area 2. For example, we had a conversation with Area 2 LCMT without them seeing those data. So I just think this needs a little bit more time. When they finish with the Area 3 data by obtaining it from the other states or fill in the gaps, I think we're going to have a much more informed conversation with the Area 3 LCMT. And I think that's the key is we need to look at what the measures in Addendum 21 and 22 are trying to accomplish, what the measures in the federal proposed rules we're trying to accomplish, and line that up with the actual changes in true effort that have transpired over the last 12 years. So I don't know if we have to answer these questions today. I think it would be valuable to see the final report coming out of the PDT, because as I said to the LCMT2 team, I said, take your time and get this right, because we don't want to have another situation where, for example, we may pass an addendum and NIMS may pause because it doesn't match up with either their standards or other rulemaking. So I would ask the board to let this bake some more, at least until the August meeting, and maybe we can take a crack at some of those questions then once the data are all analyzed.
Thank you, Dan. Just one question. A lot of your comments were focused on LCMT2. Do you plan on calling Area 3 into?
Absolutely. We just composed the Area 3 LCMT. It was so dated. Many of the members that were listed on that had left the fishery. So we were under some timelines to do that, and we didn't get that done. But that the findings that you've seen go up on the screen here, I think need to be digested by the Area 3 LCMT. So absolutely, yes. Soon after this meeting, we'll be putting that together.
Thank you, Dan. Dave Board.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This will be brief. I agree with what Dan just said. This is gonna, and just so everybody understands, this is gonna take a while to work on a number of meetings. I think are gonna have to take place. The Area 2 meeting, I thought went very well. But even there, and in their case, they implemented what the commission required. And in their case, they still need to have a couple of meetings of discussion about the component of it that relates to where we go in the future, what types of regulations we want in the future in terms of NOAA proposed one set of regulations, and obviously we would end up with a different set of regulations if we followed some of those suggestions. So that has to be developed over a longer discussion timeline. And in the case of Area 3, having been very, very involved for almost a decade, the issues there are far more complex than they are in Area 2. So it's just going to take a while to work through this. So I agree with the suggestion to not pick any of these options at this time and just allow the process to do what it does best, work through the issues, and then bring back updates at every meeting.
Thank you, David. I appreciate both yours and Dan's comments, and we certainly can give the LCMP some more time, but I think Caitlin would like to get some clarification.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to try and better understand what you're looking for from the PDT by the August meeting. So we are going to pull all those data together that I identified and look at those in terms of making recommendations for alternate measures, which was part of the original task. Is that something that you would like us to wait on until after we come back with a full set of data and takeaways from that?
Yes.
I've got Sheree and then Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would like to express a little bit of worry here that I think we still need to move pretty quickly on this if we're going to be enacting this in 2025. And I just would hate to see too much delay continue to happen. Thanks. Not to say I disagree with what we're discussing right now. I agree we need to spend some more time with the LCMTs, but we need to move quickly. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sheree. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In response to what specific objectives, the elimination of latent effort is a touchy subject with fishermen. A lot of us will move off a product that's not profitable. We know we've got the permit, we can do it later. And then if you don't use it too much, people start talking about taking it away from you. they jump back in to make sure they show a history. So you actually get an increase in effort because you're talking about taking it away. So you got to be real careful in the management of that. People that aren't doing something aren't a problem yet. And I'm not saying it's not a problem in the big picture, but you got to be careful how you tackle that one.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, I think with staff getting the clarity that they needed, at least from a plan development standpoint, we'll let the Area 2 and Area 3 teams continue their work, and then we'll come back to this at a later meeting. Thank you for that. That moves us to item number 7, which is the election of a vice chair. And before I do that, I was remiss at the beginning of the meeting and I was remiss at the end of our last board meeting to thank Jason McNamee for chairing this board for 2 years through some challenging conversations. So Jason, I do want to recognize you for the work that you did. So thank you very much for that. He'd rather have cash. So do we have Dave Borden? Dan McKernan, sorry.
I have a nomination for the vice chair. It would be Renee Zobel from the great state of New Hampshire.
Nomination from Dan and then second from Eric Reed. And that was for Renee Zobel, correct? Is there any discussion on the motion for Renee Zobel to be the vice chair? Is there any opposition to Renee being vice chair? Since she's not here, she's listening. She is back. She's hiding. With no objection, Renee Zobel is the vice chair of the Lobster Board. Congratulations. That moves us to other items that were not on the agenda. We have 3 issues. The first one, Steve Train, you had some comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe there's a motion ready. There's an issue that came up during public comment earlier today, and it was something that we did a while back, and I spoke against it. Kristen Porter said it very succinctly today. Maine fishermen don't just use their boats for work. We're like the plumber or the electrician that has a vehicle, and we still have to take it to the store or to the funeral on the way. And they might have another car, but we can't use 2 boats. So our boat is our vehicle, and this current tracking requirement is way more than is required and necessary to get the data that people want. And so I move to task the addendum 29 vessel tracking implementation work group with the input from the LEC to investigate modifications to the 24/7 vessel tracking requirement, which will still ensure monitoring of the fishing activity while acknowledging that fishermen also use their boats for personal non-fishing reasons. This should include a review of the existing processes when VMS devices can be turned off. And I'd appreciate a second.
A second by David Borden. Any discussion on the motion? Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support Steve's motion. During the initial vote on this addendum 29, I had reservations about it because I do think it's a bit of an invasion of privacy to track people when they're not using their boats. And for that reason, I was opposed to it then, as Steve was, and I'm opposed to it now. I understand the difficulties and the problems that might arise, but I think that looking into the possibility of doing something about this, is worth an effort on someone's part. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Is there any other comments on the motion? Steve Train.
I'm not asking at this point on a vote to overturn anything. I would just like it investigated to see if we can get a tool to work so that we don't have to have it on all the time.
Thanks for that clarity, Steve. Any addition, seeing no additional comments, is there any objections to the motion that is on the board? I'm going to just quickly read it into the record. Move to task an addendum 29 vessel tracking implementation working group with the input from the LEC to investigate modifications to the 24/7 vessel tracking requirement, which still ensures the monitoring of fishing activity while acknowledging that fishermen also use boats for personal non-fishing reasons. This should include a review of existing processes for when VMS devices can be turned off. It was a motion by Mr. Train, seconded by Mr. Borden. Back to the board. Is there any objections to this motion? Seeing no objections, the motion passes. Thank you very much. I'm going to now go to Dan McKernan, who had an item for the catch of lobster by non-trap gear.
Just a brief update. At the annual weekend of the Mass Lobstermen's Association, there was a lot of angst regarding what's perceived as targeting of lobsters by mobile gear within the 100 count per day. Typical March prices are high. This last March price, I think, was an all-time high. And we investigated it, and what we discovered is that under the federal regulations, the ASMFC enacted rules, which is the 100 count per day, not to exceed 500 for a trip 5 days or longer, is probably being complied with. But what's happening is vessels are unloading their lobsters on the 5th day and then resuming fishing on a trip that's longer than 5 days. So that's one issue. It's not illegal, but there appears to be increased targeting at a time when we're asking the trap fisheries to reduce, their exploitation of lobsters. And so I just want to, mention to the board that I'm working on this at the state level. And another thing that we've discovered is when we examine landings data, we see pounds, yet the rule is in number of lobsters. So it might be appropriate for the board down the road to consider a slight modification to that 100 count rule, which resides in a addendum 3, or is it amendment 3, I believe. It might be wise for us to modify that to maybe a poundage equivalent, just for purposes of examining for compliance, but that would be down the road. But there's a lot of anxiety at home about this, especially around the Outer Cape area, driven in part because lobstermen are required to remove all their gear for 3.5 months, which gives the mobile gear fleet kind of a clear lane to fish in that area. So just a heads up on that. I'll be coming back to the board probably in August with some more report on that.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. Any comments on this particular issue? So we'll wait, Dan, for your report back to the board on that issue. Is there any additional items before I go back to some of the public comment that was made? I want to acknowledge and thank those who took the time to bring their concerns to the Lobster Board today. It is unfortunate that we're in a situation where so many from the industry are just now speaking out on the issue of resiliency. That said, though, it's very clear that the realities of the change have raised some very serious concerns with the industry as a whole. When I made the motion in 2017 to initiate Addendum 27, it was my attempt to ensure that the most valuable single species fishery in the country would be resilient in the face of a changing environment, and we avoid what happened in southern New England. After several delays to deal with right whales, we finally passed Addendum 27, and I believe that passage was precedent setting. It is the Commission's very first attempt to be proactive with a fishery that is still very relatively healthy. I stand behind the approach, but I question now if we missed something. Our focus to work only with the data around sustainability seems to have missed the mark. We missed engaging the LCMTs. We missed thinking more about the economic impacts and the flow of lobster with Canada. Our normal fishery, as we all know, our normal fisheries management actions are reactionary to declining stocks. And in those instances, it's very difficult to take those socio-economic issues into account. But I think there's a lesson to be learned here. When we are being proactive, we must take the time to not only understand the science, but also explore and understand the unintended consequences. So I would propose we take the following steps to gather some additional information to determine if we need to alter the course. And we go back and take the time to consider the comments we've heard today. as well as what were sent in the supplemental materials. We continue to engage Canada. DFO has begun extensive discussions with their harvesters, dealers, and processors, and they have areas within the fishery that are considering changes to their gauge right now. LCMT was the lobster fishery, LFA 34 is one very large area that is making that consideration. And we also need to better understand how Addendum 30 will relate to this. So we need to finish compiling the public comments on 30 to understand how that relates or complicates the decisions that we've made for Addendum 27. We also need the TC to compile and combine the data for the 2023 recruit indices to see how that has changed the 3-year running average. And then with this information, I do believe that we need to consider holding a out-of-cycle board meeting to determine if we should reconsider our actions. And I am not talking about kicking the can down the road indefinitely when I bring this up. I am still squarely behind taking action that ensures that we have resiliency in place for this fishery. Again, this is the single most valuable species we have in this country. It is certainly, I can't express what this fishery means to the state of Maine and our coastal communities. So I don't want anybody sitting here on the room thinking that I am looking for just an indefinite pause. I firmly believe we must have measures in place that ensures this stock is resilient for future generations. So with that, I'd like to go back to the board to see if anybody has any additional thoughts. Again, I am not asking for action now. I am asking us to consider what those unintended consequences are for a very precedent-setting action. So does any member of the board have any additional comments? Steve Train and then Dave Borton.
I have a question that I spend most of my time on a boat, not in offices, so I'm not sure what we're allowed to do once we have an amendment or an addendum in, but we have a timeline and some tools. I think it was brought up by the public speakers earlier. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now back to that. Can we rearrange any of that? Like, can we go to the vent first so that some of the other stuff doesn't apply right away and then go up on the measure and still stay within what we've done?
I would turn to staff, but I believe we'd have to go through an addendum process in order to do that.
Any changes to what is in the compliance measures of that plan would need a new addendum to make a change to it.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. Dave Borden.
Yeah, this to you, Mr. Chairman, what process do you anticipate following in order to accomplish what you're characterizing? We're going to go back and look at some of these points that are made. Does that mean another meeting, a special meeting? How do you intend to handle that?
Yeah, I think in particular, besides going back and understanding what these unintended economic consequences are, I think we need to understand more what is going to happen in Canada. There's consideration with LFA 34 for increasing their gauge. There is consideration being made in other areas of Canada, in particular PEI, the PEI area, where they've already done one small gauge increase. I talked with DFO on Wednesday of last week. We had a very good conversation. We're in constant contact in regards to Elver situation. So we took the time to talk about the lobster issues on both sides of the border. They're now very engaged with their dealers and processors, more so than they have been, certainly more so than they had been when we had a subcommittee talk to them. I think they're very concerned in particular about that discrepancy, but also the fact that a Mitchell amendment and being consistent between the plan and the Mitchell amendment could stop the bonding of lobsters coming in to be flown out of our country to other countries, in particular China, where a lot of product comes through the US now. So there is additional information, I think, that has been coming up through their conversations. So I think giving them time to see where they are in June or early July could be the impetus for us to then consider all of the other information, to then hold a special board meeting to consider if we want to do any kind of reconsideration and move forward with an additional addendum to, as Mr. Train said, to either change any, well, to consider changing any of the management measures that we currently have in place. Follow up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's important. There was an economic study that was submitted by a gentleman in Maine, and I think that should be referred to the technical committee for review as part of that, so that we at least get technical comments on any of the suggestions that came forward under other business.
Yeah, we should certainly make sure that's done. Dan McKernan.
So I recognize the chaos that this could cause with the importing and exporting of lobsters. I recognize the challenges of the gray zone. I went to the town meeting in Moncton, and on behalf of the commission and on behalf of my agency, got up in front of the group and told them this is coming January 1st, 2025. So, you guys have some time to react to this. I would suggest that this board vote to write a letter to Canadian DFO, and if there's any trade groups, urging them to take the appropriate action to match this conservation measure in the Gulf of Maine, because we're all fishing on that single stock. And I think the points that were being made today by the industry about the discrepancies between the two countries are definitely relatable. But I'm concerned that if we are signaling that we're going to delay this, then Canada will delay their action. And next thing you know, we're back to 1990 when the industry successfully thwarted the last two gauge increases through respective state legislatures. So are we doing enough to urge the Canadian government and the Canadian processors and the Canadian fishing industry to enhance the conservation? And if not, I think we should go on the record with such a letter.
Thank you, Dan. Doug Grout.
Just a query about Dave Borden's suggestion that the economic study be referred to the technical committee. What are we expecting out of them from it? Would it be better to refer to our social and our SAS committee? I just don't know what we're going to get from the technical committee, and maybe you have some ideas of what we'd get out of it, David, from the technical committee. But
Jason McNamee.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Doug. I was having the same thought. So I don't know the full membership of the technical committee. I'm guessing there's probably not economists on there. And so the commission does have a committee for economic and social science. So we might be better served to refer that report to them. They definitely have economists on there. So we might get better feedback from that group.
Dave Borden.
That's fine with me, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to have a kind of an external review. And I just point out that our technical committee in the past has provided this board with some estimates of the impacts of different gauge increases. That's all I want to have reviewed.
Yeah.
Did they follow the protocols? Are they using the correct data? That type of review. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Tony?
I think I have a couple of notions, but I think it's best that if we're going to forward the report to the SES, what exactly do you want them to do with that report? So what questions do you have for them? Is there any additional information that we need to provide? The TC did provide a look at landing's impact when the board considered the changes to the gauge sizes at that time. So we did have that information to the board then. Should we be providing that to SES as well to do a comparison? And I'll just remind this board that I have 5 major items that staff are working on right now for lobster. So we have the Area 2-3 issue, which is time sensitive. NOAA's rulemaking will be completed in May of 2025. So if we're going to provide feedback to them to do something different, we need to do it before then. We have to gather the economic data for the Northern Edge issue. The stock assessment is ongoing. We just were tasked with trackers, and if there's something additional that we're going to be tasked with for this Area 1 size increase, there's going to need to be some prioritization going on, in particular for the TC and for staff. It'll just be too much to handle all between now and August.
Yeah, and I appreciate the need for prioritization and tasking, because and that's based on conversations that I've had with industry and with other members of the board. That's why I'm not looking at this time for taking immediate action. I think we have to have a full understanding of all the ramifications of the issues that I laid out. But Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we're talking about having another off-schedule management meeting to, I won't call it revisit addendum 27. And Tony said we would have to issue an addendum. And in the meantime, addendum 27 stands with a implementation date, effective date of January 1st. Are we able to, would we be able to meet that? Number one, and in fully understanding what you said, Pat, about the ramifications that maybe we didn't look at, thought about, but didn't look at. And, you know, regarding the economic considerations, I think your economic consideration back in 2017 was, you know, the economic considerations if the lobster industry went to heck in a handbasket. So, you know, delaying this, we could possibly be adversely affecting the lobstermen downstream a lot. So I think it's a tough nut to crack right now, but I think probably having another off-cycle meeting of more than a couple hours to discuss everything, you know, might be helpful. And as just a little small question, we had a 6-month delay, I think, based primarily on the manufacture of new gauges. Have we manufactured new gauges? Do we have gauges in place for January 1st?
I did have a conversation with one of the major gauge manufacturers, and they were in process and said that those would be available for purchase prior to that implementation date. Yep. So, thank you, Dennis. This is obviously a very complicated issue. I think I appreciate what I'm hearing from industry in Maine is we understand the needs. We just want to make sure that enough time transpires to see what's going to happen with Canada. And I think that's really the critical, or the crux of the situation. I mean, we even heard the industry put up, you know, as a 30-second approach more appropriate. Should we do events first? I mean, those are all things that I think, to Tony's point, probably need to have some additional conversations with the TC. So that gets us into the tasking. But I think to your earlier question, Dennis, from a timing standpoint, I would turn to staff, but I think if we did an out of sequence board meeting, there potentially would be time to initiate something for final action prior to an implementation date. But it would, again, to Tony's point, take some prioritization work to ensure that we're not crushing Caitlin.
And the staff.
Yeah.
Also, as a secondary issue, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a secondary issue, a lot of the correspondence we received talked about the gray area, and I understand a bit about that. But anything that we're doing, is that really going to affect or change what goes on in that gray area?
The gray area is a very complicated situation between the US and Canada. We'll certainly never resolve the border dispute, but consistency in regulations between the two countries is about as good as you possibly could get from trying to resolve some of those issues. But Tony, did you have any additional? No, okay. So I am cognizant of I'm ahead of schedule. How the hell did that happen? Dan McKernan.
Would it be appropriate for me to make a motion about a letter to Canada DFO and relevant Canadian fishing associations from the board urging them to follow suit?
It's your prerogative to make the motion.
All right,
and see where
let
it
me
goes.
give it a shot. Motion to draft a formal letter to Canada DFO and relevant Canadian industry associations as identified by the board chair and the executive director, period. This letter would request Canada increase the minimum size for lobster in the Gulf of Maine on the same schedule as the ASMFC plan as captured in addendum 27.
Before I go to a seconder on that, Dan, did you want to have anything around engagement with the board, further engagement with this board?
Well, honestly, I'm very apprehensive because I think if we signal a special board meeting, I think the gauge manufacturers will stop producing the gauges and we won't get a rule in place. Massachusetts has already had its regulations approved by its regulatory board, so we're well on our way. But it would make a lot more sense to me if we could get signals from Canada. Otherwise, we're just going to be in this quagmire of we can't do anything because it'll upset the trade balance. So.
Okay, thank you, Dan. We have a motion on the table. I've already got a second on my left, but I'll come back to you. Let's get this on the board. So we have a motion by Dan McKernan, second by Dave Borden, but let's make sure that this is perfected before we go any farther. And ask the maker and the seconder to just make sure that we've captured that correctly.
Looks good to me, Pat.
I would. Yeah, the only thing I would say that I did receive an email from Doug Wenzel, the Maritime Director of DFO, and the process that they have to follow would not allow them to achieve this. So we're going to ask, because they have a 1-year consultation process with their First Nation fishery. So I'm just raising that to make sure that the board understands that they're not going to be able to achieve that request. They're not going to get there. I'd be happy to share that email with the board. Second was Dave Borden. You second that. Yep. Second was Dave Borden. We have a motion on the board now. Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dan, I didn't know, I know you want to put a hammer on this or a timeline, but could that be modified to, or as soon as possible, so they don't feel, I mean, they might not be able to do it that quickly. So, and then if we get something back from them saying, yeah, we could probably get there in 18 months, it might give us time to match up with them or something.
Yeah, I would accept that amendment on the same schedule and then insert or as soon as possible.
I'm gonna go with Pat's rules of order and allow that as a friendly, as long as I don't see any objection. Good. Okay. Ally.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just recognizing that the commission has addendum 30 out for public comment right now, that's considering extending the addendum 27 measures to dealers. Would clarification to this on that the minimum size would apply to U.S. harvesters be helpful?
Addendum 27 applies to what the fishery is doing. It doesn't clarify, and Addendum 30 doesn't clarify dealers per se. It is, these are the measures that are in place for the fishery itself. And so I mean, we don't clarify whether or not something is a possession limit or not. That's a state's decision to make it a possession limit or not. This is what the fishery is allowed to harvest. So I would just, I don't think that we have to clarify because that is what our documents always do. Our documents don't set possession limits for a state itself. A state would do a possession limit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's given because it's related to the addendum 27. 30, I think, is obviously a separate issue, related, yes, but something that's going to come at a later time with additional board conversations. Ally, why we have your focus. Does NOAA expect to have rules implemented on the gauge increase by January 1st, 2025?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are starting the rulemaking process, but I think as I spoke at the last meeting, it would be exceedingly difficult for us to complete rulemaking in less than a year, especially in an election year.
Thank you, Ally, for that. So we have a motion on the board, seconded by motion by Dan McKernan, seconded by Dave Borden. Are there any additional comments on this motion? Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no objection, the motion passes. Okay, thank you very much. So, Eric, did you have something? No. Okay. That is all the business for the Lobster Board today. Is there making just one last call? Dennis Abbott?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. You talked about having an off-schedule board meeting. It's kind of early, but what would you anticipate a time frame for us getting together?
Yeah, thanks for that, Dennis. My thinking is to understand what's going to happen with the LFA 34 vote, which I understand will be in early to mid-June. Their fishery ends the end of May, and then what I've been told is it would be just after that. So having that information in hand one way or another